Hi, it's Super Videos back at you for another video. This is going to be a longer video. We're going to be looking at Season 6 in details. We're going to be comparing the storylines in Season 6 to the comics. So every episode in Season 6, all 16 episodes. So this video is going to contain spoilers from the comic book as well as the TV show. So if you're not caught up on the TV show until the latest episode, which is 616, don't watch this video. Or if you're not caught up on the Walking Dead comic book series until issue 100, also don't watch. So I may split this video into two, depending on how long the video is going to be. So if the title of this video says part 1, then it's going to be only for the first half of season 6. Then you can find the link to part 2 in the description, and then that'll be the second half of season 6. So let's get started. The first episode of season 6, titled First Time Again. So let's look at what happens in it. So the quarry and its setup for the Walker herd breaching Alexandria's walls was not done in the comic book and was exclusive to the TV show. In the same way, the attack of the wolves was different in the comics as well. And there was no truck and no horn to attract the walkers. The walkers were just attracted by the gunshots coming from the confrontation with the Scavengers, who were the equivalent of the wolves in the comics. Also, the Morgan Rick storyline was something that wasn't really done in the comics as well, so that was for the show only as well. The arc with Carter wanting to take Alexandria back was done in the comic book, but much later, and by Nicholas and not Carter, who doesn't even exist in the comics. So that's a similarity right there. Then Nicholas trying to redeem himself was only for the TV show as well, which was a setup for the events for 604, which we'll get to. Then we get to the next episode, which is 602, titled JSS. The Scavengers did attack Alexandria, but the wolves were more of a threat in the TV show than the Scavengers were in the comics. The attack of the wolves, which was the source for destroying the plan to lead the herd away, and the ending of their arc was different and bloodier in the TV show than it was in the comics. Then the Carl-Ron rivalry and their fight was exclusive to the TV show as well. Also, there is no Enid in the comics, so her arc and backstory was also something that was just done for the show. Also, obviously, at this point, we all know Enid is probably going to be the equivalent of Sophia from the comics, but even then, the storylines are going to be different because they have different backstories and different pasts. The Scavengers never retreated in the comics since they all died, but in the TV show, some members of the wolves were forced to retreat by Morgan and came back later to attack Rick, which we'll get to. This takes us to the next episode, which is 603, titled Thank You. This is the famous Glenn episode. So the group never leaves Alexandria's vicinity, so the whole being surrounded by the Walker herd outside of Alexandria includes Michonne, Heath, as well as Glenn and Nicholas. This was just done for the show, and it wasn't in the comics. The arc with Nicholas and Glenn and the famous dumpster scene was also done for the TV show only, and it wasn't in the comics at all. Also, like I said, Rick never encountered any members of the Scavengers or the Wolves outside of Alexandria, so his face-off with their members was only for the TV show. Then, also as a byproduct of that, Rick being trapped in the RV with the Walker herd being attracted towards him was also just for the TV show and not the comics. That takes us to the next episode, which is 604, Here's Not Here, the Morgan backstory. So in the comics, none of the members of the Scavengers were imprisoned. So Morgan's arc with the wolf he put in a cell was only for the TV show, and there was nothing like that in the comics. Then the Morgan backstory was never done in the comics as well, so that was just added for the show as well. Then the next episode, 605, Now. Rick returning to Alexandria with the herd behind him and attracting the herd towards the safe zone was not done in the comics and was added for the show. But this is where the show and the comics kind of meet back up, because the herd is at Alexandria's stores, surrounding the area, like in the comics. Then the whole arc with Aaron and Maggie in the sewers and the news that Maggie's pregnant was also for the show only. Although Maggie was also pregnant in the comics, it was not announced in this way, and to Aaron. Then Ron never asked for shooting lessons from Rick in the comics, so that was also added in for the TV show only. Actually, Ron never existed in the TV show, and Jesse Anderson only had one son, and it was Sam. So the whole arc with Ron was new because he's a new character and wasn't in the comics. And Rick never saved Douglas as well in the comic book, who is Deanna's counterpart in the comics. So that's also for the show only. Now, Douglas does transfer leadership to Rick, but it is in a different way than how Deanna does in the TV show. But it's similar. It's similar. So this takes us to the next episode, which is 606, Always Accountable. Now, Xavier's first encounter with the group does not occur at this time and in this way in the comics. It happens much later in the series. So that's different. Dwight is never seen before his face gets burned in the comics. So his encounter with Daryl is exclusive to the TV show. For this reason, and since Daryl does not exist in the comics, the setup for his rivalry with Dwight was added for the show. So everything in this episode is different because it's basically a setup for Dwight, which was never done in the comics. Then the next episode, 607, episode 7, Heads Up. This is the Glenn returning episode from the dumpster thing, and us, the audience, getting to know that Glenn is alive. So Glenn's return is also part of the arc for the show, since his fake-out death was never done in the comics anyway. The arc between Morgan and Carol and the wolf, who was held prisoner, is also for the show only, since obviously there was no prisoner in the comics. Then Spencer trying to climb the rope was done in the comics as well, like in the TV show, but the circumstances and the setup for it was different. But it was similar enough to be labeled as something that was an adaptation of the comics. Then the wall coming down was done in the comics, but because of an entirely different reason. But again, you can say that it was similar to what happened in the comics. That takes us to the next episode, 608, start to finish. This episode is basically the official start of the No Way Out storyline from the comics. The events leading to a portion of the group being stuck in one of the houses is longer and more intense in the comics than it was in the TV show. But it's close enough to be counted as a direct adaptation of the source material. So we can say that's a replication of the source material. And it's the first one, I would say, in this season up to now, the episode we're looking at. Then the continuation of the story of the imprisoned wolf is something that was done for the show only. Then Carl's fight with Ron for the show only, and then Deanna and Douglas's death were similar between the show and the comics. However, Deanna was much more brave than Douglas was portrayed in the comics, but we can still say this was a replication of the events in the comics. Then the start of the confrontation with the Saviors on the motorcycles happened in the comics as well, but Rick was present in the comics at that point, and there was more dialogue between them. So we can say this was similar. And so, just to go back for a sec, this episode has the most similarities to the comics than any other episode up to this point from season 6. So, let's get to the next episode. The next episode, 609, No Way Out. The continuation of the encounter with the Saviors was very different in the show than the comics. In the comics, Rick killed them, except one to go back and report to Negan. But in the show, Daryl blew them all to pieces. So it differed in the comics in this way, because in the comics there was something to move the story forward a bit. But in the show, it was kind of ended, and that was the end for a little while. Then the plan to escape the Walker herd was different in the comics as well. The events leading up to the climax, which was the deaths, was a little different in the comics, but it was similar enough to be labeled as something that was done in both mediums. Then the resolution of the herd attack was shorter in the TV show than it was in the comics. And obviously the deaths were almost identical to the comics, so we would say that's a replication rate there. And also Carl losing his eye and being taken to Denise to take care of him was done in the comics as well, so that was a direct adaptation as well. And then obviously Rick's speech to Carl when he's lying down in a coma is the same way as well as what it was in the comics. So again, this episode and the previous episode were almost identical to what happened in the comics as in an overall storyline, and they had the most similarities than the other episodes. So that's it for part 1. You can watch the second part, which is the second half of season 6, in part 2. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back for the next one.